Bonjour à tous et bienvenue pour ce nouvel entretien du Club Mémoire et Avenir de l'Association des anciens fonctionnaires de l'UNESCO. Nous parlerons aujourd'hui des archives qui occupent toute une aile du sous-sol du bâtiment de l'UNESCO, place de Fontenoy. Souvent ignorées de nos collègues, elles renferment un véritable trésor, la mémoire institutionnelle de l'organisation et les témoignages documentaires et audiovisuels de son action. Elles sont une source inestimable de connaissances de l'histoire intellectuelle de notre époque, avant même la création de l'organisation en 1945, puisqu'on y trouve aussi les archives de son prédécesseur, l'Institut international de coopération intellectuelle, qui remonte à 1924. Comme le proclame sur son site le Conseil international des archives, qui rassemble des archivistes du monde entier et dont nous célébrons cette année en juin et à l'UNESCO le 75e anniversaire, un archivage efficace est non seulement essentiel pour la conservation de la mémoire collective de l'humanité, mais il participe aussi à la bonne gouvernance et à la transparence des institutions dans les États membres. Pour aborder ces enjeux essentiels, nous avons le plaisir d'accueillir aujourd'hui Faxon Banda, qui dirige depuis février 2020 l'unité du patrimoine documentaire de l'UNESCO et son programme Mémoire du Monde. Ce programme, qui a célébré ses 30 ans en 2022, veut favoriser la conservation du patrimoine documentaire mondial ainsi que l'accès universel à ce patrimoine. Nous comptons aussi sur la présence d'Eng Seng Savang, archiviste à l'UNESCO depuis octobre 2017. Entre autres responsabilités, elle collabore à la diffusion des données et des documents d'archives en ligne, ainsi qu'à leur bonne conservation numérique. Elle est bien connue du Club Mémoire et Avenir. On lui doit un passionnant échange en 2019 sur l'ancienne salle de presse de l'UNESCO, chef-d'œuvre du design des années 1950, aujourd'hui enfoui sous des kilomètres de câbles téléphoniques. Enfin, nous sommes heureux d'avoir parmi nous Adama Pam, archiviste paléographe et docteur en histoire de l'Université de Dakar et depuis janvier 2018 archiviste en chef de l'UNESCO. En dehors de la gestion des documents administratifs de l'organisation, il contribue au développement des activités archivistiques dans les États membres et des relations avec les organisations professionnelles telles que le Conseil international des archives. Tous trois échangeront avec Jens Böll, chef archiviste à l'UNESCO jusqu'en décembre 2017 et membre actif du Conseil international des archives, notamment de sa section sur les archives et les droits de l'homme. Il fait également partie du comité exécutif de l'Association des anciens fonctionnaires de l'UNESCO, dont émane le Club Mémoire et Avenir. À toi, Jens.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Neda, for this introduction. And indeed, it's an honor and it's a great pleasure to be with all of you today, with you and Faxon, Adama, Eng. And today, well, indeed, we, as Neda mentioned, this is the 75th anniversary of the International Council on Archives, which was in fact created by UNESCO at an expert meeting at UNESCO, in any case, in 1948. So this was part of the capacity building work of UNESCO in the field of archives. UNESCO has done so much more, of course, over the years in terms of preserving archives and making them available, ensuring access to them. But Faxon, if we look at the mandate of UNESCO, it's the same, basically. I mean, ensuring preservation and access. At the same time, so much has changed in terms of technologies, digitization, artificial intelligence, and so forth. And societies have changed as well. So first of all, I would like to ask you, how do you see the challenges in the coming years? What are the most important priorities in this field from your point of view?
Right. Well, thank you so much. I'll try to answer that question from the point of view of the Memory of the World program, which I am in charge of. Now, in the last 30 years of the program's establishment, we have clearly seen immense challenges and opportunities, as you have stated, in the field of documentary heritage preservation and accessibility, of which archives and records management is but one part. In the last 3 years, the COVID-19 pandemic has clarified issues even more. In that sense, I see three main challenges and opportunities today and in the coming years. The first concerns the changing face of the profession of archives and records management itself in light of rapid technological changes. Increased focus on digitally accessible documentary holdings has meant that archivists, librarians, museologists, even technologists, and so on and so forth, have had to undergo a refinement of their knowledge and skills in order to better serve their clientele. Dealing with documentary heritage as data, for example, has meant that training needs have had to adapt to include a range of competences that embrace, among other things, document preservation, digital rights management, new forms of dissemination, interoperability management, digital literacy even. You mentioned artificial intelligence. Indeed, there are questions there as to the ethics of artificial intelligence, particularly if deep learning can be used in digital preservation, determining the provenance of documents, for example. What would that entail? All this has meant a reorientation on the part of archivists and other documentary heritage managers in order to understand the implications of such a technological revolution. Second, linked to my point on professional reorientation, you will agree with me that memory institutions are faced with the challenge and, I would argue, related opportunity of exploiting the digital space for greater accessibility of documentary heritage. At the core has been the process of digitization of analog, archival, and other documentary heritage. More so, digitization has resulted in a process of digitalization of entire management systems of preserving and accessing archives and records. Now, this is not a play on words. So digitization is a very simple activity of scanning analog documents so that you can access them via computers and other devices. But digitalization, on the other hand, is a much more involved process that means transforming entire memory institutions in order to take advantage of the digital opportunities that are there. Obviously, the challenge for us in the Memory of the World program is to ensure that this applies to developing countries as well, particularly in African countries and small island developing states that may not have the same technological advantages as developed countries. To this end, our focus as a program is on support to memory institutions in these countries. Thirdly, and finally, talking about accessibility, particularly in the digital realm, a key challenge has been to ensure that documentary heritage becomes more meaningful for ordinary people and can be used as a source of information and knowledge. In this respect, the adoption of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals serves as a guide for our work. For example, we are selecting items of documentary heritage that can be incorporated into curricula for schools, working with the UNESCO Associated Schools Network aspect. As far as we are concerned, this will ensure that we contribute towards target 4.7 of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is all about ensuring that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of the culture of peace and non-violence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity. We are also collaborating with Google Arts and Culture in a strategic partnership that ensures we provide samples of our documentary heritage as content for their online platform. Obviously, this is in an effort to amplify access to these treasures, particularly by younger people. Our focus is also on target 11.4, which is about strengthening efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. And we're trying to do this by applying a disaster risk reduction as a strategic framework for preserving documentary heritage and ensuring its wider dissemination. And finally, with respect to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we are also focusing on target 16.10, which is about ensuring public access to information and protecting fundamental freedoms in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. So in a nutshell, those are the three challenges and opportunities that we think face archivists and other documentary heritage managers.
Thank you so much, Faxan. In the archives, in the UNESCO archives, you preserve and provide access to documentary evidence on all UNESCO's activities. And this includes then UNESCO's work in capacity building for archives around the world and archivists around the world. So can you tell us about the categories of sources that you keep in the archives, and what kind of information do they contain if you look at the history of UNESCO?
Yes, thank you for the question, and thank you for this opportunity. So to answer your question, well, first of all, the UNESCO Archives is a deep and rich source of the work of UNESCO on archival development, and at an international level, also the thinking on how to develop archives and how this development of archives is linked to a lot of what Faxan was just speaking about, national development, technological change, the impact of archival development on society in general, and in particular areas. So I'll just mention 5 key sources in the UNESCO archives, but this just is skimming the surface of what is available. UNESCO's work developing archives began even before its existence with its predecessor organization, as Neda mentioned, the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation, or the IICI. The IICI established what would be considered maybe a proto-International Council on Archives, which today is the international body, professional association for archivists around the world. And so in the UNESCO archives, we have files related to this International Bureau of Archives and Archival Sciences, which studied questions related to access to archives, training, conservation, the use of archives on an international level. So they were already thinking at a very early stage about these issues. The IICA also published the first international guide on archives in 1934, which is almost 400 pages long. Mm-hmm. And then another source is the Guides to the Sources of the History of Nations, which was initiated in 1958 in collaboration with the International Council on Archives. And this series is very interesting because it was focused especially on anticipating the needs of newly independent countries. And the series includes guides to documentary sources on the history of, for example, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. And for example, there's a 3-volume series of on African sources in India, resulting from the history of Indo-African relations from antiquity to the modern period. And many of the published volumes and internal files on the creation of the series are available for consultation in the UNESCO archives. The third source I will mention related to UNESCO's work on the development of archives is a series of publications and activities called the Records and Archives Management Program, which UNESCO established in 1979, and it's known as RAMP, R-A-M-P. This was also created to meet the needs of member states and particularly developing countries and in particular to raise awareness among governments, especially, of the value and usefulness of archives as basic information sources. So over 100 RAMP studies were published covering a wide range of topics, and as well, the RAMP program sent experts, archival experts on missions around the world. And some of the topics covered include the preservation and conservation of archives, particularly national archives, management of records and archives, the creation of standards, policies, and plans at all levels, archival legislation, access and use of archives, and practical manuals. So for example, some interesting practical manuals include the archival appraisal of sound recordings and photographs, or the prevention and treatment of mold in humid climates. The program was both working at a high level and also at a very practical level. I also mentioned the mission reports of experts, archival experts sent around the world by UNESCO to build capacity within the domain of archives in various member states, which is also a very rich source of work in this field. And finally, of course, there's UNESCO's flagship documentary heritage program, Memory of the World. And we have the nomination files in the UNESCO archives, as well as the records of the International Advisory Committee and other related files on the development of this program and the concepts and practice of this idea of a universal documentary heritage.
Thank you, Eng. Well, here you mentioned contributing to capacity building in member states, and Faxon also emphasized this point. So maintenant, je voudrais se demander, Adama, bonjour. Toi, tu es chef archiviste de l'UNESCO depuis janvier 2018, et parmi les engagements que tu as faits, tu as, entre autres, tu as beaucoup travaillé pour soutenir l'archivistique dans les États membres, notamment en Afrique. Tu as fait des missions aussi dans les États membres avec cet objectif. Est-ce que tu pourrais nous parler un peu de ta vision pour ce travail et également des résultats concrets que tu as pu obtenir?
Merci beaucoup. Merci Jens, merci chers collègues. Alors, ma vision, elle s'inscrit dans la continuité des actions de mes prédécesseurs, mais surtout, elle s'inscrit dans le mandat de l'organisation qui a une vision très forte pour la préservation de l'héritage documentaire, pour l'accès à la culture et à l'information. Alors, cela dit, je voudrais rappeler que l'UNESCO, dès sa création, a eu à cœur les problématiques archivistiques et de préservation de l'héritage documentaire du monde. Déjà en 1945, parmi les signataires, les créateurs de l'organisation, on s'est rendu compte que l'héritage documentaire au monde a énormément souffert pendant la guerre, mais aussi il y avait un souci très fort pour la préservation des archives du tribunal de Nuremberg qui avait cours déjà en 1946. Cela dit, parmi les rédacteurs de la constitution de l'UNESCO, nous avons Archibald MacLeish, qui est un archiviste, mais nous avons aussi surtout un autre archiviste, Opocensky, qui était le délégué tchèque, qui va être le premier chef archiviste de l'UNESCO. Nous devons à Archibald MacLeish la formidable phrase dans la constitution de l'UNESCO qui dit que la guerre prenant naissance dans l'esprit des hommes, et c'est dans l'esprit des hommes qu'il faut instaurer les défenses de la paix. Mais cela dit, dans mes investigations, on voit également que le deuxième directeur général de l'UNESCO, le poète mexicain Torres Bodet, qui nous dit cette merveilleuse phrase sur les archives, en disant que les archives sont indispensables à la continuité de la conscience humaine et donnent la possibilité d'une bonne gouvernance et elles renferment les traces instructives de la vie. Le troisième directeur général de l'UNESCO, Luther Evans, qui est aussi un archiviste, tout cela fait qu'il y a une forte conscience archivistique au niveau des décideurs de l'organisation. Et ils vont tout faire, déjà dès la création de l'UNESCO, à travailler, à structurer la communauté archivistique internationale par la création de l'ICEA en 1948. L'UNESCO va financer, organiser à Mexico tout cela et organiser à Paris la première conférence qui va faire naître le Conseil international des archives. Alors, l'UNESCO va beaucoup travailler avec le Conseil international des archives, surtout en Afrique, au moment des indépendances des pays africains. L'UNESCO va travailler à envoyer des missions d'experts, à conseiller les États pour la planification archivistique au niveau national, mais à créer aussi des écoles de formation d'archivistes. À Dakar, l'école régionale pour les francophones, et au Ghana, une école régionale pour les anglophones. Mais l'UNESCO ne s'arrête pas là. Ils vont travailler également avec le CIA à créer, à dépouiller les sources de l'histoire de l'Afrique conservées dans les pays occidentaux, mais à rédiger la formidable histoire générale de l'Afrique et créer aussi des centres régionaux de collecte et de préservation de la tradition orale. On a beaucoup parlé également des missions d'experts et de formation des professionnels africains, mais aussi le CIA et l'UNESCO ont collaboré pour renforcer le statut des archivistes en Afrique et un peu partout dans le monde. Par rapport à mon implication depuis 2018, j'ai eu la chance, en commençant mon mandat à la tête des archives de l'UNESCO, de participer tout de suite en 2018 au Congrès mondial des archivistes tenu en Afrique à Yaoundé. Et j'ai prononcé une conférence sur comment l'Afrique fait face à ses archives après les indépendances. Par ailleurs, j'ai travaillé avec le bureau de Maputo au Mozambique à rédiger la stratégie nationale de préservation de la mémoire archivistique de ce pays et assister à des programmes de formation des archivistes à Dakar et à Brazzaville. Et dernièrement, j'ai accompagné la directrice générale au lancement de la chaire UNESCO qui réunit l'École nationale des chartes, l'Université Senghor d'Alexandrie et l'École des bibliothécaires, archivistes et documentalistes de Dakar. Cette chaire UNESCO réfléchit sur la problématique des archives et des sociétés africaines. Et je crois que c'est un ensemble de projets, c'est une vision qui tend à faire des archives un élément important pour l'accès à la culture, l'accès à l'histoire, mais également la préservation des droits des citoyens et des droits de l'homme d'une manière générale. Naturellement, notre action ne se limite pas qu'à l'Afrique. Hein. Actuellement, nous travaillons à la sauvegarde des archives des comités privés de sauvegarde de Venise. Je suis allé en mission accompagné également de ma collègue Eng Seng Sevang. Mais aussi, nous travaillons à la numérisation et à la mise en ligne des archives de l'organisation pour permettre un accès ouvert à tous les États membres et aux chercheurs du monde entier. Voilà rapidement un peu les projets dans lesquels nous sommes investis et je pense que tout cela rentre en droite ligne dans le cadre du mandat de notre organisation.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Adama. Je pense qu'avec ces 3 interventions, nous avons déjà fait un tour d'horizon avec des interventions complémentaires et très riches d'informations et d'analyses. Alors, now I would like to proceed with one question more for each of you, and then afterwards, you may follow up with questions to each other or with comments on what has been said. So we'll do that afterwards. But first, one more question to each of you. So, Faxon, well, the most well-known of the activities of UNESCO in the field of preservation of documentary evidence and heritage is probably the Memory of the World program. And in recent years, this program has, well, some member states have expressed concerns over certain inscriptions in the International Register of the Memory of the World. This has led to some tensions and even to the freezing of the International Register. So since then, UNESCO has worked hard with member states to find solutions to overcome the problems and to re-establish trust in the Memory of the World program. So I would like to ask you, Faxan, how do you see, how can you describe the process in recent years? What is the level of success in rebuilding consensus around the Memory of the World program?
Thank you for that question, difficult though it is. As you have correctly pointed out, the Memory of the World International Register was put on hold in 2018. The idea behind that action was to provide a calm and serene environment for UNESCO member states to negotiate the reform of the Memory of the World program as a whole. I must clarify one point, however. While the register was on hold, all other aspects of the program were being implemented, including capacity building activities for memory institutions across the globe. In fact, I think the program performed much better without this focus on the Memory of the World International Register. But I digress. There were two key issues that member states needed to resolve. These concerned, one, the legislative framework of the Memory of the World program, and two, the nomination process for the International Register. It was decided that both these issues would be tackled by way of revising the general guidelines of the Memory of the World program, which had hitherto been prepared by experts with little or no input from member states themselves. In fact, this was one of the key sticking points. In terms of process, member states, through a decision of the executive board, started with an open-ended working group. Everybody could participate. And this particular working group resulted in agreement on most issues, but fell short of consensus on other issues. It was then resolved, again, through a decision of the executive board, to establish a limited participant working group to work on the remaining issues. Limited participant working group because it was a number of member states that took place and not everybody else. In 2021, the executive board approved the revised general guidelines along with the revised statutes of the International Advisory Committee. Now, putting it this way might delude you into thinking the process was smooth. In fact, it was a very difficult process of negotiation among member states, but eventually it happened. Now, in summary, member states agreed on the following key issues. One, that the Director General will continue to appoint members of the International Advisory Committee to serve in their individual capacities as experts to assess nominations for the International Register, but that such experts would be taken note of by the Executive Board. So the Executive Board getting involved there. Two, that the assessment of nominations for the International Register would continue to be undertaken independently by the International Advisory Committee, including through its register subcommittee. Again, that's a good point because it respects the sanctity of the expert community. Number three, that nominations, while open to everybody, would be submitted by member states via their national commissions for UNESCO or some such body. This is to make sure that there is a form of intergovernmental oversight at that early stage of submission. Fourth, that contestations, this is a key issue, that contestations of nominations between and among member states would be resolved through dialogue, either bilaterally or through mediation or facilitation. And this is an important point. Lastly, it was resolved that the recommendations of the International Advisory Committee as to which nominated items should be inscribed on the International Register will be endorsed not by the Director General, as was the case, but by the Executive Board through an information document. Now, we have since relaunched the Memory of the World International Register. We have received some 88 nominations, and the process has unfolded. It is a new system. We are piloting it. So far, with some difficulty, I can say that it is holding. We can only hope for the best during and after the upcoming session of the Executive Board in May 2023. But to answer a question directly, there is some success in this process after all.
Thank you, Faxon. This was, I think this was extremely helpful for everybody interested in this matter, which is indeed, as you pointed out, very complex, but it was, your explanation here was very clear, and I think lots of colleagues will appreciate this. So I'll move on to you, Eng, because you talked about the rich sources in the UNESCO archives on UNESCO's work in this field of archival capacity building. But what about the use of the material? I mean, is there an interest for this, and how do you facilitate access for researchers and students and so forth?
Thank you for this question. So first of all, the UNESCO archives are pretty well used in general. We have about 400 to 500 visits a year by researchers all over the world, as well as UNESCO staff. This said, of course, the UNESCO archives could always be better used, and this is one area that we would really like to focus on, is the valorization and communication of what is in the archives. In terms of the sources of UNESCO's work on archival development, unfortunately, it's not as well used as, they're not as well consulted as they could be. Practically speaking, I can remember 3 researchers in the past few years who have looked into this area, and one of them is our very own chief archivist. So there's a lot of potential to make real contributions in this area, and to bring this important topic to light. For example, when Faxon was speaking, I was just thinking about what a fascinating documentary archivist will make in terms of discussions around the use of archival experts and the relationship between this idea of archival documentary heritage and the political implications and the relationship to nation building and an identity. So in terms of the how the material could be used, there are many different topics that that could be covered. that are very fascinating. For example, I mentioned before the idea of newly independent countries and UNESCO's work in the area of developing countries. And so what's very topical today is this research on decolonization. And this is one area that could really, archival development really has an impact and has really played a role. So the processes of decolonization, post-independence, nation building and archival development, what is the relationship there? The return and restitution of archives and archives in conflict. And of course, the history of UNESCO's major programs related to archival development, which were mentioned previously, such as RAMP, and also the General Information Program, or PGI for short, which was for a long time the larger framework of UNESCO's archival management program from 1977 to 2000. And of course, the impact of the Memory of the World program in raising global awareness and discussions and debate and even controversy in terms of the role of documentary heritage on various levels.
Thank you. There was a lot of inspiration, I think, in what you just said. Thank you, Ing. And Adama, maintenant, je voudrais te poser une question, disons, liée à l'avenir également. Et basée sur tout ce qu'on a entendu, c'est clair qu'il y a beaucoup de, disons, des activités, des champs de travail où les unités, l'unité de Faxon et l'unité des archives de l'UNESCO ont des intérêts communs et peuvent, disons, soutenir l'une l'autre. En effet, il y a une quarantaine d'années, dans les années 80, les deux unités, c'est-à-dire l'unité pour le patrimoine documentaire et les archives de l'UNESCO, étaient formées une seule unité, en effet, au sein du secteur de communication. Alors, donc, comment est-ce que tu vois les synergies possibles et quelles sont les possibilités de s'entraider, de coopération dans les années à venir?
Merci beaucoup. Alors, c'est une excellente question. Faxon et moi, nous avions beaucoup collaboré sur des chantiers sur le terrain, en Afrique particulièrement. Faxon m'a convié à la consultation internationale à Bamako sur les manuscrits du Sahel. Et j'ai également représenté l'unité de Faxon pour la préservation de l'héritage documentaire de la Fondation Amadou Hampâté-Bâ à Abidjan pour former les archivistes qui gèrent ce patrimoine documentaire très important pour l'Afrique, pour la compréhension de l'histoire de la tradition orale en Afrique. Mais Faxon aussi a été membre du comité de pilotage de la numérisation des archives de l'UNESCO de 2018 à 2020. Mon unité a aussi accompagné, par exemple, le musée Tuslang sur le génocide au Cambodge et contribué à la rédaction du manuel Managing Low-Cost Digitization Projects in Least Developed Countries and Small Island Development States. C'est un manuel dans lequel Eng également a participé. Naturellement, on peut toujours améliorer les choses. Nous devons renforcer cette collaboration. Surtout mettre nos compétences et nos moyens ensemble pour mieux servir les États membres. Le fonds de l'IICI, l'agence prédécesseur de l'UNESCO, a été classé dans le registre Mémoire du Monde. Donc, l'unité de Faxon a labellisé un peu une partie de notre fonds d'archives historiques. Et cela, je trouve que c'est très important. Son unité peut nous aider à lever des fonds à mieux, à continuer à numériser et à mettre à la disposition des États membres notre histoire commune, qui est celle de l'histoire de l'UNESCO, mais qui est aussi l'histoire des États membres. Donc, cela dit, je pense aussi que, par exemple, sur la commission de classement, le registre mémoire du monde pour l'héritage documentaire, nous pouvons apporter aussi notre accompagnement, notre aide pour accompagner aussi l'unité de Faxon afin de mieux évaluer les dossiers sur les questions archivistiques qui relèvent également de notre compétence. Voilà, cela dit, moi je pense que l'avenir est à une synergie des moyens et des capacités parce que nous travaillons finalement tous pour les mêmes objectifs, pour la même organisation, pour servir le même mandat.
Merci beaucoup, Adama. Donc, il y a une forte histoire déjà et des belles perspectives pour l'avenir. Alors, now I would just like invite you, if you wish, to make any further comments, or if you have questions or suggestions to one of the other participants in the panel, then please go ahead. Yes, Faxon.
Yes, it's not a question, but based on what my colleagues have said, and especially in concerning the use of archives, at UNESCO, I think perhaps we should start with ourselves. We've got so many program staff here at UNESCO that would benefit from the archival services on offer. In fact, even the library services on offer here at UNESCO. I realize that sometimes in the preparation of briefings for the Director General, we might need to take a historical perspective that contextualizes those briefings. So perhaps I would like to suggest that we can together, and I'm including the library here as well, organize a workshop for members of staff to try to familiarize them with the archives and what they can offer by way of supplementing what they are already doing. I think that might be useful. First of all, we need to see the value of the archives ourselves before we can externalize that.
Excellent. Well, that was a concrete proposal to you, Adama and Ing. What do you say?
Adama probably has a good response as well, but I am thrilled at this suggestion, and I absolutely agree with everything that Faxon just said. We would love it if the members of the Secretariat would use the archives more. Some of them do, but there is definitely a need for a campaign of awareness building and training and knowledge about what's available in our archives that would really help to, in fact, support the mission of UNESCO and support the work of our colleagues, exactly as Faxon said.
Adama, est-ce que tu voudrais ajouter quelque chose?
Je suis tout à fait d'accord. C'est to practice what we preach. Nous essayons de délivrer un message aux États membres et il nous faut également commencer par nos propres archives, par notre propre mémoire institutionnelle. Et c'est tout à fait juste ce que dit Faxon. Nous faisons face à des problèmes également de moyens financiers pour soutenir notre action. C'est général au sein de l'UNESCO, mais par notre ingéniosité, par notre collaboration, tous ensemble, je crois qu'on arrive à poser des jalons pour améliorer au quotidien le service que nous rendons aux États membres, aux chercheurs et au public d'une manière générale.
Merci Adama. Je pense que c'était une très belle conclusion en effet sur ce webinaire. Alors donc moi, de ma part, je vous remercie chaleureusement et je donne la parole, je rentre la parole à toi, Neda.
Oui, un grand merci à tous pour ce passionnant échange très riche en perspectives, encourageantes et prometteuses. Avant de nous quitter, je vous recommande de visiter sur le site de l'UNESCO l'excellent portail en ligne du service des archives qui, sous le titre « Numériser notre histoire commune, projet de sauvegarde et de promotion du patrimoine documentaire de l'UNESCO », donne accès aux archives et aux collections audiovisuelles historiques de l'UNESCO. Visitez aussi la page du programme Mémoire du Monde qui œuvre à préserver et protéger le patrimoine documentaire mondial en le rendant accessible à tous. Enfin, ne manquez pas d'aller sur le site du Conseil international des archives où vous trouverez de nombreuses ressources sur le métier d'archiviste et la conservation des archives. Merci de votre attention et à bientôt.